we start, right? So we don't have a lot of people, but I feel people are late. So I'll introduce you, Maryna, right? So thank you to everybody who came. I know it's, lunchtime, things on working day, so it's really challenging to get a lot of people in. But thank you so much for coming. We have a new guest from Ukraine, and Maryna Rabinovych is visiting us for 2 months, and she's working on a very interesting project, which is related to Minsk peace agreements and the strategies and blame game scenario, credit claiming strategies of Russia and Ukraine in Minsk agreement process. And Maryna is delivering today a talk about this topic. She's going to do more research while she's staying at UTS with C.Hub. But today she will give you like a brief overview of what she's working on, and she's keen to hear your questions, your feedback, your vision of the process. So before we jump into Maryna's presentation, I wanted to use Maryna and like give you some bio before we start. So Maryna, has several positions, right, at the same time. So she is involved in teaching, and she has a position at Ukraine. So she is an assistant professor at Kyiv School of Economics. So she teaches online. She has students, she teaches online regularly. And she's also now have a position in Norway through Scholars at Risk, right? Scholars at Risk program. And she's doing a postdoctoral research project, which is called Lowering the Bar, Compliance Negotiations and the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, funded by the Research Council of Norway and implemented by University of Agder in southern Norway. So she combined several roles at the same time, which is great. And we're very lucky to have Maryna visiting us here in Australia. There was some delay, but thank you so much for coming. And we can't wait to hear what you're going to say, right, about the Minsk peace agreements and the blame games and claim credit. Thank you. You're welcome to start. Yeah.
Thank you very much, dear Ola. And first of all, I'd like to start by thanking the USF for this opportunity, and also thanking Olga and CTAD and the UTS for hosting me. Indeed, there was quite a delay of 3 years. Nevertheless, I think it's still topical to speak about the Minsk agreement and reflect on this 8-year-long negotiation process. Why you will learn a bit more during the presentation, but just to give a bit of a teaser, we hear the word negotiations in the context of EU-Russia relations quite often now, and we have had this experience. Nevertheless, it wasn't very much reflected on, and that's why it's crucial to see how this Minsk process has undergone, why it actually failed, and how, if and how we need to learn from it for the future in case there will be any future negotiations. Also, going beyond Ukraine, looking at such peace processes relevant because there are many conflicts around the world and many places where there are different powers coming together in the negotiation table in a much less friendly atmosphere than here. And also these processes may last a lot of time. And in this time, people even get sometimes lost in all these communications that surround these processes. So that's why it's worth thinking about the Minsk process and reflecting on it, not just for Ukraine, but also further. So in terms of the organization of the talk, I'll try to be swift in order to allow for us to have time for discussion and also time for questions and criticisms and so on. And so I will first speak about the background and research idea, then I'll try not to bother you with theory and methodology too much. And after that, we'll jump to findings and discuss main discourses that Russia and Ukraine have been using in the process surrounding the communication of the Minsk peace process, and then we'll conclude. So first of all, I'd like to say that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22 put an end to this long-term debate about separatists in eastern Ukraine that we have heard about for a while. It has become clear to the world that Russia has played a big role in the whole destabilization process in Donbas, even though during the peace negotiations it tried to portray itself constantly as a kind of a third party, as a kind of a party that just wants peace and reintegration of the territories into Ukraine. So even though now everything is pretty clear and still it makes a lot of sense to look at the Minsk peace agreements and specifically the role of the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic as proxies and the way Russia has used them in order to put itself as far as possible from the conflict and also claim credit in terms of its negotiations with Ukraine, but also speak to the West. Also in this project, I connect this perspective of proxies and peace negotiations to international law and try to see from the international law perspective why it makes sense to speak about the proxies and not just about different parties of peace negotiations. Also, as I said, this project is relevant for other countries, especially in case we hear about civil wars. So nowadays, all these differences between international and non-international conflict are usually quite blurred. So we may think, okay, this is a civil war between party A and party B, which both belong to the same state, but at the same time, the support the third country may provide to one of the parties may go so far that this party is already a party to the conflict. Also, there is a lot of use and misuse of different actors by big powers, as we saw with Russia utilizing the construct of people in Donbas and Ukraine. And that's why this precedent has a lot of importance in international law. However, international law is developing very slowly, and we can see it with the court, with the peace processes that and the reflections on them in the International Court of Justice, in the International Criminal Court. It all may take years and decades for courts to produce these decisions. However, it's already now important to reflect on this process, and that's why what I try to do here is to use the literature on blame games and claiming credits. So this is the literature in the international relations theory, and it says that it's common for countries to blame each other for things that they don't like, if we put it very simple, and at the same time claim credits, so say that they're good and someone else is bad. And also, in terms of literature, I have used the international law literature and tried to dig into this problem of proxies and whether this notion at all exists in international law and whether in any kind of conflicts someone has legally used the concept of proxies in international litigation. So generally, I would like to say that in legal terms, this all remains pretty uncertain because international law tries to delimit very, let's say, hardly between international conflict and non-international conflict, and that's it. So it tries not to look at this kind of gray area in between. However, if we think about the communication science, and that's why it has been important to be with the communication school, that examining these issues of proxies is interesting from the standpoint of using the literature and communication, so on how actors present themselves, how they try to present the responsibility structures, so the situations, and who is responsible for the specific state of affairs, and also claim their positions. So this kind of communication here sometimes is much more useful than legal literature. So in methodological terms, I have looked at discourses, and discourses is basically how we construct something. So this is a constructivist perspective, and the idea generally with constructivism, as I try to convey to my students, is I always say to them, like nothing is real. It's just how you construct the world around. This way it's gonna function. And this is a way, actually, I think Russia is quite a proponent of constructivist theory. They try to construct the world around for their citizens and manage to do it quite successfully. So understanding not just the facts and not just the legal facts, but also discourses and constructs is very important to understand contemporary politics, because in contemporary politics, so many things are about information, about Twitter, about positions, about claiming that nothing can be certain, that all the time, the positions may change. And today, Elon Musk comes and says you one thing, but tomorrow, for example, I know Pope Francis comes and says to you another thing. This is all constructivism, how they construct reality, how they construct, in our case, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And that's why also the work of various advocacy people, of NGOs, of human rights protection activists is very important, because they try to change these constructs. So in my approach, I have looked at these discourses and constructs in three most popular Russian media outlets, and then three most popular Ukrainian ones, just looking at the ratings by their readership at the moment when the research was convened. And also in the case of Russia, I added the website Ukraina.ru, which it's just dedicated to Ukraine. And that was a reason to look at it additionally, because even though they dedicate a lot of attention to Ukraine almost in all their media sources, this website is very particular because it only conveys news about Ukraine and nothing else. Even though it's part of this big holding where Margarita Simonyan is working. Here you can see these sources. In Russia, there were RIA Novosti, RBK, Lenta.ru, and Ukraina.ru. And in Ukraine, Ukrnet, Ukrainska Pravda, or TSN.ua. So this was at the moment when the research was conducted. And also here in media analysis, it's quite important to know what the media sources actually are and who funds them. So you can see that in Russia, all these media sources are in fact anyhow related to the state. So we cannot deem them entirely independent. And at the same time, we can think that the state has quite a leverage on them, and that's why these media kind of reinforce their constructs and positions that the Russian state has or has had vis-a-vis the Minsk Peace Process. The method of analysis is focused reading. So it means you just sit down and read Russian newspapers. So for this, you need to have quite a stamina. And then you just read Ukrainian ones or try reading them in parallel. Also, you have a kind of coding. So you just select all the words that are related to the topic that you look at, like the Minsk Peace Process, the Normandy format, war, also used Euromaidan and so on. So I had like 40 of these notes, and then I analyzed about 40 texts. So this analysis, it's limited in time to 2022, and what I'm trying to do now is also to look a bit beyond and see how the communication strategies have changed after the full-scale invasion, and whether the parties continue sticking to what they have been saying before, or also whether they somehow relate the current war and the failure of the Minsk Peace Process. However, so far I haven't had the results of this reading yet, so just focus on the situation before the war. So to give you a bit of a background, what the Minsk peace agreements are, there were two Minsk peace agreements. The first one was concluded in 2014, second one in 2015. And there is no such a big difference between them. And the reason why there is not such a big difference was because 2015 is basically an elaboration of what was there in 2014. Because the 2014 agreement was breached by Russia, and then Ukraine had to respond very quickly. So then the parties came again to the negotiation table and concluded the second agreement in a pretty similar way. Substantially, Minsk agreements include two blocks. The first one is security, the second one is political. So security is basically for the parties to withdraw all soldiers and heavy military equipment from this area of Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts that went outside Ukraine's control in 2014. And the political bloc is largely about reforms in Ukraine that should have been conducted for these territories to be reintegrated back to Ukraine. So security bloc, to make it simple, is more applicable to Russia because Russia had all these, let us say, illegal military formations at this territory and also heavy military equipment like tanks and artillery systems and so on. And Ukraine, in exchange, promised to do some political reforms, including the reform of the centralization of power, so that this region, when it reintegrated, would have had more powers than it had before, and also quite much autonomy when we speak, for example, about the use of Russian language. And also, in the Minsk peace agreements provided for a broad amnesty so that all the people who participated in these events in Donbas couldn't have been put in jail or somehow brought to responsibility under Ukrainian law. So why Minsk agreement failed? One of the common answers is the lack of sequencing of the steps, what should have been done first and what should have been done thereafter. The position of Russia has been that Ukraine first needs to conduct these big reforms and also make changes to its constitution about the status of this region, and also accept, let us say, the conduct of local elections at the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk, so-called People's Republics, and then Russia will withdraw its soldiers and equipment. Ukraine was arguing vice versa, saying that you cannot conduct elections at the territory where there are troops and illegal military formations that threaten people, and people cannot express themselves in a free and impartial way. And they demanded that these elections should be observed internationally, so that representatives of the OSCE and other organizations and countries can come and say, okay, these elections were free and impartial. So this was the key matter in organizing this peace process, in fact, whether Russia first has to go away and then the elections will be held, or Ukraine first needs to do the reforms and then the elections will be held. So at some point, then President of Germany, Steinmeier, came with the so-called Steinmeier formula when he was arguing that first, that Ukraine will make some, let's say, starting steps towards reforms, then elections will be held, and at the same day, at 12:00 the next day, Russia will have to remove its military formations. Zelensky almost agreed to the formula at some point, but then after say quite much popular discontent and also discontent by expert community, was saying that still insisting on the position that Russia first needs to remove its military equipment and troops from the region, then international community should come and acknowledge this fact, and only thereafter the territories can be reintegrated. So Putin was and manipulating the Minsk agreements close to the war, trying to push Ukraine to start direct talks with the so-called separatists. This didn't work because starting direct talks would have meant acknowledging them as subjects, so to say, as people whom you can talk to. And that's why it has been also another, let us say, red thread in negotiations all the time, because Russia was wanting to get sanctions lifted so that Ukraine acknowledges, and for this, it needed Ukraine to acknowledge that there are some separatists, that this is a civil conflict and not the war, and it tried pressing into this, but Ukraine didn't agree to this. So now in literature, many call Minsk the attempt of Russia to use Trojan horse strategy. This meant that Russia actually wanted these territories to be reintegrated to Ukraine, but then use people there coming to the parliament and coming to other bodies of power from these territories in order to influence Ukraine's domestic and foreign policy. So this has been, I think, even acknowledged by Lavrov in one of his statements when he called Minsk Agreement one of the biggest successes of Russian diplomacy. So the idea initially has been that Ukraine gets these territories with all these Russia supporters, and then they get infiltrated much more stronger than they already were into all aspects of Ukrainian politics. However, since Ukraine wasn't accepting all these, let's say, ideas, then Putin used these territories as, let's say, in order to begin the war, arguing that Ukraine commits genocide on them, and therefore he was also trying to mimic the situation with Serbia and Kosovo when NATO started the bombardments of Serbia. They were also arguing that it's because of genocide in Kosovo. But the situation was that the genocide at that time was much more real, let us say, put us in plain words, than compared with the situation in Donbas. And Putin, in fact, even they were creating some artificial situations in Donbas, trying to first evacuate people, then putting them somewhere to Rostov and making them come home by themselves. So trying to create this kind of, let us say, image that there was some kind of genocide, even though committed by Ukraine, even though then the International Court of Justice very quickly said that it was just Russia's entities. So in the future, what such agreements that were difficult to implement and practice because of the lack, let us say, of a specific strategy to do so, are called formalized political unsettlement. So they don't really resolve the conflict. They contain it for some time because there is ceasefire. It seems that there is no violence. However, it also doesn't bring any solutions. And this is, I think, the biggest scholarly conclusion and summary of what the Minsk peace agreements actually were. They were formalized political unsettlements. At the same time, both parties used them and created a lot of discourses around them. And now I will try to, let's say, reconstruct for you the sequencing of these discourses so that you can understand how they have been developing and how they have eventually come closer to the war. So the first one is coming back to the times of Euromaidan, because Russia is one of the earliest and most favorite discourses with regard to Donbas is that it was a coup d'etat, so kind of illegal overtake of power in Kiev because of Euromaidan, and these led to the fact that people in Donbas were disagreeing with this situation, and that's why they decided to have independence and have their own country. So there they depict Euromaidan as a kind of a starting point for the whole situation and also blame the United States for organizing Euromaidan, which they still do, even though Euromaidan has been over 10 years ago. And why they do so also is to deny that the conflict is of international nature, to deny their own involvement. So they give, let us say, subjectivity to these people in Donbas and put blame not just on the US, but also on Ukrainian authorities and also their specific representatives arguing that these people brought the situation to the civil war, like Alexander Turchinov, for example, who used to be the president, who used to act as a president after Yanukovych ran away and before was elected. So even in some articles I found Turchinov being called a butcher or say a person who already then was discriminating people in Donbas. They were also arguing the draft language law that was discussed in the parliament and adopted already shortly after the change of power after Euromaidan, also claiming that this is kind of a plan supported by the United States to, let us say, infiltrate into Ukrainian politics and which people of Donbas were disagreeing with. Also, they represent these people, and this is a third discourse as a part of Ukrainian population, but not the ones that accepted the 2014-2013 coup d'etat, and argue that Russia protects the rights of these people. So this is interesting because now they already almost always argue that these are Russian people. But at that time, or they say between 2014 and 22, they were commonly saying that these are Ukrainian people or population of Donbas. So with time, it kind of they started to get them more to themselves and kind of argue they are Russian. At that time, they were mainly positing them as Ukrainian. And they were arguing also and blaming Ukraine constantly for committing genocide against these people. And also with time, we can see that this rhetoric has been sharpening. If we look at the discourses back to 2014, 15, it is still all quite, let's say, innocent. There is at least no word genocide. But with time, now this genocide rhetoric has become more and more pronounced in the media. Then also what Russia has been arguing constantly is that Ukraine doesn't fulfill the obligations under the Minsk agreement, and they were blaming Kyiv for not willing to implement the obligations, not engaging with people of Donbas, and at the same time claiming credit to themselves as the participant of the Minsk Peace Process that does everything according to what has been agreed. And after that, again, they have justified the start of the full-scale war by the fact that Ukrainian authorities failed to implement their obligations under the Minsk agreement. So again, this is the attempt to deny themselves being a party to the conflict, but trying to portray themselves as a kind of supporter of these people of Donbas. Similarly, it's not just Ukraine that is all the time, say, playing a major role as a party to be blamed in Russian discourses, but also the West. And the West is kind of a broad notion in Russia's view. So quite often they just say the West, Western partners, without specifying which countries they mean. And sometimes in the West, even the East is included. If we speak, for example, about Japan, it's also quite funny. Sometimes they just say the West and then mention Japan also there. Again, if you see earlier discourses, this is all quite soft, blaming the West for not, let us say, making Kyiv to implement the Minsk agreement, say, being not a genuine party of negotiations, but at the same time, with times, the rhetoric again becomes sharper and sharper, and the West is being accused of misusing Ukraine as a proxy in the war with Russia, so trying to make Ukraine anti-Russia and then weaponizing it against Russia. Also, following the invasion, they have been blaming the West for waging an economic war, so with sanctions, and also with time we see the sharpening of the rhetoric and the nexus between Ukrainian nationalists and the West, so that with time it is being portrayed to Russian population that the West is misusing and weaponizing Ukrainian nationalists in order to make Russia weaker, and Russia at the same time fights for the future of people in Donbas. So what Ukraine says about it, so the Ukraine's key argument has been that Russia is a party to this international conflict in Donbas. So they have continuously denied the idea of any civil war taking place. So Russia is being portrayed as a sole actor responsible for the situation that arose. And at the same time, they have been portraying the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics as puppet regimes, arguing that they are fully controlled by Russia, and therefore it's not possible to have direct negotiations with them. Also, Russia was blamed for not willing Minsk negotiations to bring any real success. And as I said, in terms of the sequencing, one of the key discourses all the time has been that first security arrangements need to be implemented and then the political ones. Also, at the time, the discourse that arose mostly following the start of the war has been that Minsk agreements were a trap for Ukraine, meant by Russia to get political control over its decision-making on foreign policy and domestic policy. And here it's also an interesting thing that with time also Ukraine started blaming the West, but for having Minsk agreement as a sole, let's say, option for negotiations. So after, for example, the Normandy format, France and Germany saw that the agreements don't work. They didn't suggest anything new, rather than try to all the time dance around the same agreement. So in some articles, you can find references to blaming the West for not finding any alternative ways or not supporting, or to say, the entire renegotiation of the Minsk. At the same time, Ukraine has been claiming that it defends its sovereignty and territorial integrity for already 8 years, so if we think from the moment when the full-scale invasion began. And also with time, another discourse that became more and more, let's say, prominent is the fact that Ukraine protects European values and European security. This wasn't the case mostly in the beginning of the Donbas war. However, afterwards, especially after the full-scale invasion, one of the biggest discourses Ukraine tries to develop is that it actually protects not just its sovereignty and territorial integrity, but the interests of the West more broadly. And most recently, for example, Budana was saying that if Ukraine doesn't get more weapons, then the cities of the Baltics can become similar to Bakhmut or Avdiivka. And this is the quite a picturesque example of this last discourse. So, let us say, Russia is increasingly arguing that it is in the war with the West, while Ukraine is increasingly arguing that it's protecting Western security. So the West, let us say, broadly conceived, is still a very important actor in this constellation. So to conclude, I would like to say that these kind of blame games and claiming credit have been very central to the implementation of the Minsk agreement. So these discourses have been accompanying the whole process from the very beginning towards the very moment when Putin recognized Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics as independent states before invading Ukraine. And also this Minsk topic is still continuing, even though Russia chose to start the full-scale invasion against Ukraine. So the key topics go around, let's say, and concern the parties to the conflict and the nature of the conflict. So whether the parties of the conflict are Russia and Ukraine, or Ukraine and these people of Donbas, and whether the conflict is international and non-international. So this challenge of having proxies, so for example, with Crimea, everything is crystal clear. Here is Russia, it annexed Crimea. Everybody in the world recognized this quite early on when Crimea was incorporated in the territory of the Russian Federation. However, having these proxies, these Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, significantly changed, made the situation significantly different from the situation with Crimea, because many years there have been this belief that there are some people of Donbas who want something, who are not satisfied with the situation in Ukraine and so on. And having this proxy issue also significantly influenced the perception of the conflict by international judicial institutions and international legislators. We can see it even in the most recent case with the ICJ, when ICJ didn't fully acknowledge that Russia was behind these people of Donbas, even though it kind of acknowledged that they were financed by Russia, Russia provided weapons to them and so on. They still refused to call this financing for terrorism. So it's a big topic about how politicized international courts are and how much states actually have influence of them. But nevertheless, let us say this unclarity, this gray zone with proxies made it significantly difficult for Ukraine to argue its position about Donbas on the international arena. So overall, this case is very illustrative if we think about proxies in international conflicts, occupation, who is an occupier, and to say how occupation happened. And also it shows how peace negotiations can be very lengthy, very complex, and eventually lead to a big war rather than settle a smaller conflict in territorial terms. So that's being all on my side. And just before finalizing, I would like to.
Or maybe we'll leave it to the
Okay.
end, right? Like maybe we'll have a discussion and then we'll do this announcement. Yeah.
Okay, good. Then we stop at this point. And
Yeah, I think we can have a question, right?
Yeah.
The question time. Thank you, Maryna, so much. Interesting topic, right? Because it's a dead topic in a way, right? So Minsk agreements are dead, right? But interesting to understand, you know, how it developed, what was on both sides, and yeah, why it's important maybe now, right? Does anyone have questions? You could, yeah.
Yes, sorry, I have a lot of questions, but I'll just start off with one and see how we go. This is sort of a bit new to me, the way that you presented it, and I was thinking about what you said and how you, I think, said to your students, you talk about constructivism, yes? Now, is that kind of like the only framework that can be used, or I'd just like to know a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think my students hate me for the international relations theory class, where I present the three key international relations theories. In fact, there are more, but at least for, let's say, the start, there are three. And there are constructivism, realism, and liberal internationalism. And I'll be just very simple. Constructivism is that we, let us say, construct everything by ourselves. And this theory allows you looking at perceptions, identities, values, and mostly the method will be to look at texts and how, let us say, different actors frame and narrate things. This is constructivism. Another framework is realism, and realists, they just argue that states want to, by any value, to preserve their interests. And this framework is also very often applied to analyze Russia-Ukraine war. For example, one of the notorious representatives, Merzheimer, he was arguing that it's actually the West that started the war because West went to Russia's traditional sphere of influence. He got a lot of criticism for this, but this theory is mostly about these kind of big powers and great power competition. And the third one, liberal intergovernmentalism, it just argues that states, if it matches their interests, they can cooperate, and international cooperation kind of produces more cooperation and institutions, and all these cooperation institutions, they allow preventing wars. So as you could have seen, liberal intergovernmentalism and internationalism is not very well, let's say, applicable in the case, because it, for example, cannot explain why, even though EU and US and were cooperating with Russia quite closely, where Russia took this big risk of invading another country and basically made itself subject for sanctions. So there is one very interesting article about this that looks at Russia's risk-taking and, let us say, overall this why countries take risk in international relations. And it's about cost-benefit considerations, but also some irrational factors can come into play. For example, again, these constructed ideas of the importance of the Soviet Union, of big Russia, and so on. This is again constructivism. So these frameworks, they are very much interrelated. And in one research, one can also use different ones. However, this constructivism here, why it's interesting, because it basically unpacks in much detail what parties say and how each of them presents the situation and attributes blame and tries to, make itself look better.
Yeah.
Where do you think it will end?
And how? Yeah, like
Oh, I don't have an answer to the question. By the way, when you said it's a dead topic, I don't
yeah,
entirely
so you don't okay.
because
Why?
very often you can see the word combination Minsk 3,
Did he?
And
Yeah, I haven't seen.
especially in Ukrainian media, you
Oh,
can
really?
see Minsk 3 in connection to the idea of negotiating with Russia now.
Oh,
So one
okay.
of the arguments why not to start negotiations with Russia is that Russia already didn't want to implement Minsk 2, so
Mhm.
we shouldn't go to Minsk 3.
Ah,
And
okay.
therefore, this kind of Minsk concept, it's not entirely dead because it
Okay.
still somehow comes into
So
the
it's
media.
symbolic now for something that doesn't work, right? In a way.
In Ukrainian discourses,
Yes.
yes.
Mhm.
But also in Russian discourses, in the Russian nationalist discourses, they argue that it was the West that was making Ukraine not implement Minsk. And in this way, they were preparing Ukraine to a big war and kind of trying to make Russia enter this big war in order to weaken it. So this kind of conspiracy game, but this Minsk thing, I think it cannot be called dead because people still speak about it and still use it to justify other claims.
Just to backtrack, who initiated the Minsk process?
How much?
Who initiated?
Who initiated
Yeah,
the Minsk? Yeah.
yeah.
I think
Poroshenko?
so from the Ukrainian side, it was Poroshenko. And I don't know exactly who gave this first, let's say, idea or impetus, but the participants, officially, there are three parties in Minsk agreements, and the parties are Ukraine, Russia, and OSCE, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and they were kind of brokering the agreement. But I also heard, at least I don't know whether it's a conspirological version or not, that Putin was threatening Poroshenko that he will employ more power in Donbas, and
Sorry, who was
that he will use more power because
but who
in
was he threatening?
Putin, because in Donbas, initially they were only using land power, they were not using aircrafts and so on. That he was threatening Poroshenko that he will get support from air and make the conflict much more bigger and more dangerous. And this was actually, and this I read in some sources that this threat made Poroshenko, and also the awareness how weak the army was at this point, made Poroshenko go for the agreements in order to contain this kind of bigger conflict.
Yes, that's right. Like, how much do the Russians really believe like this works in the construction that it's obvious that's been created around all of it?
But you know, even I was impressed when I was reading these sources in a systemic way. If you start reading from oldest ones and come gradually to newer and newer ones, year by year, month by month, that even you know, to some extent, you see how well constructed they are. That they start with Euromaidan as this kind of illegal protest, as a coup d'état, and then come to Donbas people who disagreed because they wanted to speak Russian and not be made speak some different language, and then Europe comes and into play in the West and so on. So it's basically pretty logical. I wouldn't say that it bears some really logical mistakes that one would have been using to argue against. So I think that Russians quite believe into it, unfortunately, and we can see quite many examples if you look at Telegram and look at different channels of Russian nationalists. You can see that many people commenting and many people, you know, speaking about Ukrainians there and labeling them as nationalists and Banderovцы and all this. That this, I think, really has quite a footprint in their collective, let's say, perceptions of the situation.
Why do the peace agreements have to take place in Minsk, which is Belarus, which is more friendly to Russia? Why not a more neutral country? Why, someone that's more leaning toward Russia? Why does that, the agreement take in a different, why not a different country?
Yeah, at that time, if you come back to 2014-15, Lukashenko was still a legitimate president in the eyes of the West. And still there is this idea of kind of three-head Slavic countries like Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. I think this has been the reason, like Slavic friendship, getting rid of the problem and being together again by Minsk was chosen. However, as you might remember, when the war already began and already 2 years after Lukashenko became illegitimate after protests, then first there was again Minsk, but then the parties changed to Istanbul. So there was at least one attempt to change and go to another place. And also I think Lukashenko himself likes to be this broker and likes feeling himself important and making Minsk important in the eyes of both Ukraine and Russia. And therefore, probably he was also propagating for Minsk to be the place where the parties were meeting.
For his own political.
Yeah, exactly.
He's a PR manager, you know?
But just remember how he was navigating in the beginning of the war and not to get involved.
Not very involved now.
I mean, in terms of really sending his soldiers, not just Putin using his territory.
And to what extent do you think Poroshenko contained it where it was?
I think he managed to some extent, at least the war didn't go,
Sure, but was it him and his policies, do you think, or was it Putin just biding his time? Because I'm sure Putin wanted to keep going
I think they were
early on, or
both.
not, or don't you think he did?
I think they were both because each party was trying to use this break for its own purposes. Even though I think Ukraine could have probably used it more efficiently in terms of preparing the army and in terms of producing equipment and so on. But at the same time, Russia was, I think, trying to pursue two strategies at the same time. On the one hand, it really wanted to reintegrate these territories into Ukraine and get more leverage onto Ukrainian parliament so that they reverse the course on European and Euro-Atlantic integration. This is one thing. I don't think that they necessarily knew that they would go to a big war. I think this was just a second strategy in case the first strategy wouldn't have worked. But I think that having this first strategy, if we think, for example, that I also thought about this, what would it look like in case Ukraine would have agreed to speak to these terrorists and somehow get these territories back? I think this wouldn't have given peace to Ukraine either, because then there would be again the same discussion, and Russia would have again very well say that Ukraine doesn't respect the agreement, that it doesn't respect the autonomy of these people, political terms and so on, and could again go to a big war just a little bit later. So I think this kind of discontent, it wouldn't have helped to speak to these terrorists, even though at some point I thought it would have been a good idea to get more time and also to maybe try to buy it just in financial terms, simply give them money so that they become calmer. But on the other hand, Putin has so much money that probably this wouldn't have worked.
To what extent do you think it's fruitful to look at, to do this kind of work around analyzing the comms and the discourse in Transnistria, in Georgia, in other places? Because this, you know, the more we kind of look back into this history around international relations and discourse creation, it just feels very, maybe I'm just getting old, but it just feels really like a playbook that gets rolled out.
Yeah.
And that Putin in particular, although Transnistria, I think, predated him doing it, it's just something that the Soviet / Russian, well, I guess it is all Russian because it was post-91, wasn't it? Transnistria it was probably before you were born. You're much younger than I am. But you know, have you thought about maybe doing this work in other contexts?
Yeah, we were doing the book with one colleague who is going to be here in 2 weeks, where
Hannah.
yeah, where
Mhm,
in my
yeah.
chapter I was discussing the legislative aspects comparatively, trying to see how Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia portray conflicts and these territories in their legislation. And then Georgia had the most severe approach, almost not allowing any exchange and trade relations with these territories, with Ossetia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, while Moldova was quite liberal and mitigating and so on, and Ukraine was a bit in the middle at that time in 2020. So I tried to do it from the legal standpoint, but not so much from the standpoint of discourse. It's also because with Georgia there haven't been any active negotiations for a while, and with Moldova the negotiations are also very much kind of flat and taking place also for much longer time. And I think they're even less politicized now. At least they used to be less politicized before Putin again started to play this Transnistria thing. So probably this could have been interesting, but there what prevents one from comparing them in the right way is the difference in context, because negotiations were taking place not in parallel but different time, and the context was very different. So maybe a bit challenging to look at it. But when it comes to playbook, I really agree with you, because I also did one chapter on Kosovo and why Kosovo discourse is so important in Putin's justification for the war. So there I tried to kind of unpack what they thought about Kosovo and about afterwards the NATO bombardments of Yugoslavia, and why this was also a bit of a turning point for Putin, when he didn't like that NATO got into this operation without having got the permission from the Security Council, but at the same time Russia itself was blocking the Security Council. So Putin thought, okay, if NATO can do it, then I could also do it, because he's always trying, to be on the same scale than NATO.
With Georgia, well, Ukraine refusing to extradite the Georgian dissidents that Georgia wants them to, does that push them to Russia a bit more?
I think that this is the biggest thing. I think really that they also, especially now, they're afraid when they see how the big war looks like, so they try to navigate and be in between. So my answer is that they really try to be in between, kind of trying to move to the EU to some extent, also to favor citizens in the young generation who want this, but at the same time, they are too afraid to make some kind of radical moves. Even Moldova, especially with Maya Sandu, I think they are much less afraid. So they are afraid, but they are moving, but Georgia is afraid and not moving.
Moldova's closer to Europe.
And
I mean, in a geographical sense.
Probably also this, but also I think personalities really matter. Like I think had it not been Maya Sandu, maybe it would have been much more difficult for Moldova to move. She is quite specific in her commitment to bring Moldova to the EU. But with Georgia, it was interesting for the EU, because EU at first didn't grant Georgia candidate status in June 22. It granted candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, but not Georgia, because Georgia was really backsliding in all the reforms in the recent years and not having any single reason why to give it something, some kind of reward. But then they gave it to it in 1.5 years, mainly because they were fearing that if Georgia doesn't get it, then it would even more turn to Russia, and the EU will lose its leverage even more than it did before. So for the EU, really they had a note from the people from the Commission that they had a lot of discussion what to do with Georgia, and decided to give it a chance and not lose leverage there, and give them candidate status after all, and open the accession negotiations also soon.
I was in Georgia last year, and it was very obvious the anti-Russian sentiment, especially into policing.
Yeah, I think this like everyday level, everyone is pro-Ukrainian, but when you go like government pro-Russian, like it's very, I think there's a big like big difference. Yes, like, and right? Is that right? Right?
I also met some people, especially older people in Tbilisi, who were quite pro-Russian when I was there. Maybe it was just, I think in Georgia, it's actually also a generational matter. or maybe I was that successful that at least I met many pro-Russian
Well,
people.
the older people that I met were actually, they remembered what it was like with Russia in charge. Yeah, one of their museums had a whole thing about what Russia had done to them years ago. People disappeared, all the rest of it. So I thought it was really out there that they were acting. Not really, no. Some people don't.
Can you say that you were not really looking at the frameworks around that, or were you? Just to circle back, because I don't remember the methodology, where you were looking just on the sort of assumptions, or were you sort of analyzing the frameworks that imply that process?
Yeah, so here I was really mostly focusing on discourses,
Yeah.
but I tried to see, let us say, the legal rationale. Why do these discourses make sense from the standpoint of international law? For example, it makes sense to say that there are some people of Donbas in order to argue that the conflict is a non-international conflict, and say why you impose sanctions on me for this. This is their internal thing. Or why do you sue me in the international court? So I looked at this rationale, but I didn't really go into analyzing the international law sources and trying to establish whether something whether something is true under international law. Also because I find this works, it makes sense to discuss qualifications by international courts and try to understand their logic and so on, but to sit and qualify things yourself, I think it's also very biased, because then, I know how things are and how they at least should be from the normative perspective, but then the reality is very different, and to analyze it in legal terms and to not be biased, I think is very difficult being a Ukrainian. So here, deconstructing discourses is much easier. It's much easier to be objective because you just read it in a focused way and systematize. But if you try to qualify in legal terms, then for me, for example, downing the Malaysian airplane, providing these Donbas people with weapons, and even the very fact that Putin recognized them as independent, for me, this is enough to say this is a sponsorship for terrorism. But for the International Court of Justice, it appeared not to be enough. And that's why I don't like this kind of qualification attempts so much in this kind of realm.
Like limitation of the research in the way, it's not necessarily your bias then, it's just because the institutions or that you observe do make very different calls from how you look at when what decide.
But there is a lot of research about the politics of law, politics of international courts. I have a very good colleague in Germany who works specifically on the politics of law, and she did her dissertation in Kosovo, and we also discussed that this ICG decision to say that it doesn't, go against international law for Kosovo to be independent. She also found it very politicized. Also, the court kind of ignored many questions it was posed to in this final decision. So she looked very nuancedly and took interviews to find out how the discussions in the court were, and so on and so forth. So it really also just people who are taking these decisions, and these people can have their ideas about the countries, can be corrupt, can have plenty of things that influence their decision making. So I think it really makes sense to study the politics of international law, but not just try to apply the norms of international law ourselves.
I suppose this slides back to your idea, I think, of discourse. You've used the term conflict and war, and in this instance, when they had the Minsk agreements, how did they view it? Was it a conflict? Was it a war? What was the discourse around that?
I would say that from the international law perspective, there is not such a big difference. They call all the wars conflict. So for them, conflict is just a broader term. And I think they never called it a war officially. So in scholarship, you can find the term Donbas war or war in Eastern Ukraine, but in the agreements, it will be always conflict or something, let us say, milder. And I don't think it's so many people criticize, especially now in Ukraine, if you call the war a conflict. But in formal international law terms, it's not a mistake. It's just, that people want to underline how brutal it is and how awful it is and so on. But in international law terms, it's not a big mistake. It's not a mistake at all.
The reason I asked it was after the Russian invasion, there was, I think it was at Belli Library, they had a discussion group, I think it was called the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and there was a lot of ill feeling about using that term. And so from what you're saying, conflict is just a general term, but would you describe what's happened after February 2022 as a conflict or a war?
Both terms are fine because conflict is just a more general term being used in international law to also say about the war. So it wouldn't be a mistake to say it's a conflict. It's just, again, in discursive terms, how we construct it. For us, it's a war, and conflict is just some kind of conflict. Also, there are some connotations in language use. So for me, the conflict, I know with my friend that we didn't manage to find a common way how to resolve something. And the war is Russia's war against Ukraine. But for an international lawyer from South Africa, there is conflict in Ukraine, conflict in, Ethiopia, conflict in another country. It's normal in international terms to call it a conflict.
So what you're saying is they carry the same weighting in international law.
Yeah, for us, like it's emotional, right? With the war.
For us, it's kind of how we construct it, how we perceive it.
No, I don't think, well, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an international lawyer, but I don't believe that. I think that war actually does have, I'm actually just looking right now.
I think you can I think I even read this kind of a big contribution about war and conflict, where they were arguing that conflict is kind of a more general term, and it can be it can be international when there are two parties to the conflict, and non-international where there is a civil war. And again, it's fine to call civil war a non-international conflict.
So they could still have the same level of intensity.
Yeah, and also you can say, for example, there was some term about conflict, kind of, you can say low intensity conflict. If there is just some, breaches of ceasefire at some moment, you can call it low intensity conflict. Or also there are protracted conflicts. There are a lot of, terms that are being used in this regard.
Can I ask a question just about the term proxies? Because we have this conversation at home all the time. Is when does a party become? When is that term actually relevant and when is it not relevant? I'm curious. You were in the earlier part of your discussion. You said, when a party starts actually making decisions, how do you define a proxy?
Yeah, so here in this paper, I wasn't using it as a legal term. I think, because I even wrote it in the footnotes.
There's
Yeah.
probably a line that has to get crossed before you.
But what you can really find, what I liked a lot was this contribution by Georgian lawyer, where she put the whole situation in Donbas, the occupation by proxy. So she has this complicated double last name, and there she was looking at this concept more from international viewpoint. So if you're interested, you can make a picture and read how she was approaching it, but international law as such doesn't have real test for establishing whether someone is a proxy or someone. And for me, it's mostly when they get both directions what to do and the means of doing something. For example, if they're being said to, take and defend some city against Ukrainians, and they being given weapons by Russia, then they are proxies. So when they don't have the autonomy to make their own decisions, and at the same time getting technically and financially supported by another power.
So in your, so that's the sort of, it's like autonomy and means. It sounds like.
Yeah,
what you're
yeah,
saying.
let's say this, but in this contribution, I found it interesting about this occupation by proxy, because occupation is an established term in international law and international humanitarian law. For example, an occupying power is responsible for observing human rights if it occupied some territory, for providing citizens with basic needs and so on. And this was actually the basis how Ukraine referred to the International Court of Justice with Crimea, arguing on asking international court not to recognize that Crimea was annexed, but asking it to sue Russia for Russia not observing the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So this was kind of this approach, because international court doesn't have direct competence to recognize some territory as occupied. But what it can say is that whether there was a breach of rights of people there or not. And that's why Ukraine was referring to the rights of Crimean Tatars. And this was also the approach used by Georgia before, but unsuccessfully. Ukraine, I think, got a bit further in these terms so far. And this proxy issue adds to the situation, because with Crimea, Ukraine was using this approach to refer to the rights of Crimean Tatars, but in Donbas it actually couldn't, because it couldn't argue that the territory is occupied by Russia, because Russia didn't legally didn't anyhow legalize this occupation itself, arguing that there is a separate actor of these people of Donbas. And this makes this difference, and therefore the author called this occupation not just occupation as Crimea, but occupation by proxy, and argued that in international law there is no way to really establish this occupation by proxy and somehow even protect the rights of people who are living at the territory occupied not by some specific country, but this kind of non-state actor who is a proxy of another country. It's very difficult with Russia even to try to get it observe the rights of people who are at the territory of Russia that it occupied, but at least it's a bit easier, because there you can say that Russia is responsible for them and it cannot deny it because it formally incorporated this territory. And I think this can also maybe explain why in Donbas there are a lot of torture chambers and a lot of prisons, like isolation prison, where a lot of people are being kept. But in Crimea, at least as far as human rights defenders say, there is not such a big network of these kind of institutions. I think also actually because they regard Crimea as theirs, and therefore there is a bit more responsibility they have there.
Yes, I'm just mindful of time because we have to leave the room, right, by 2:30. Yes, so thank you so much. I think it was interesting talk because, as I said, in media, I think people talk about Minsk agreements as a dead topic, right? But it's interesting to look back, and analyze, the whole rhetorics, discourse